This is Viticulture, where we share conversations with makers, growers, thinkers, and doers, folks who cultivate a good life. My name is Chris Missick, and I'm a lawyer turned winemaker in the Finger Lakes region of New York State, and I'm sitting down with great people in wine and other walks of life to hear their stories, learn their lessons, and take their advice on the perfect pairing. In this episode, I'm sitting down with a man who has been called the Robert Mondavi of the Finger Lakes, a pioneer that has taken his winery, Fox Run Vineyards, to great heights, and in the process has helped build the Finger Lakes wine region as well. He's been a friend, a mentor, and a business partner of mine this last decade. We're sitting down with Scott Osborn to discuss his early days in the wine industry in California, the explosive growth of the Finger Lakes wine industry, his exploration of geology, and the legacy he hopes to leave behind. If you like this content, please help us grow by liking this video on YouTube and subscribing to our show on your favorite podcast platform. Don't forget to visit our website at viticulturepodcast.com. Subscribe to our Substack, where you'll get show notes, transcripts, musings, and exclusive offers. And check us out on all the major social media platforms. And now, here's the show. So we are famous in our wine region for cold and snow and ice in the winter. But I want to start this conversation with fire. There was a fire at your home years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that it sets the tone for some of the adversity we face personally, but how our community and our industry comes together.
That was, well, I can tell you this. When your home burns, it's a life-changing experience. And it's an immediate life-changing experience. You know, for instance, the wine industry and what I've been part of here is a long-changing experience. Yeah. But boy, that house burning was a life-changing experience. And what was amazing was the way the community came together to support my family and I to help raise some money so that we could buy underwear and toothpaste and, you know, all of those things that you lose when your house burns. And it was just an amazing experience. A group of people threw a fundraiser, and people came from all over the state. Wine industry people came from all over the state, and even distributors, you know, there's sales managers and stuff showed up for this, and it was at Anthony Road, and you know, John and Ann offered up their place for this fundraiser, and it was quite the experience.
Now, for anyone who hasn't been to Fox Run, the house is right next door to a really cool old barn, which is where, you know, the tasting room is in. There were just so many things that in that minute when you realize it's burning down. I mean, what was going through your head?
Well, what actually was, as I sat there and before anybody showed up, it was just me and my son, and only one car had driven by the house in the 15 minutes or so that we were standing outside, and which is unusual for Route 14. Yeah. Route 14 is the 20th most traveled road in the state of New York, and only one car drove by, and she'd actually stopped and you know, came running up to see if there was anybody in the house, and we were already out. But as I sat there, I just kept saying to myself over and over, tomorrow's going to be a different day. Yeah. You know, and then the fire department started to show up, and it was pretty amazing because Art Hunt from Hunt Country, which is almost a half an hour away, he's a fire chief, and he heard the call on the radio, and he drove all the way over. Wow. It was pretty amazing, and we didn't get out with any clothes. overcoats and stuff. So it was one of the coldest evenings I'd ever experienced. And I was standing there, and Art walked up and he said, "Here, take my coat."
Wow.
And he says, "Don't worry about it. I'll get it when you're done with it." So,
and it being in October was on the heels of, the busiest time of year for us. That had to be a real challenge for you.
Well,
you're exhausted. You lose your home.
Yeah, and it was just different. And fortunately, it was right at the end of October.
Yep.
So we were done with harvest.
Yeah.
And it was that period of the customers aren't coming in anymore. The harvest is over, and so there's this letdown that happens, and that the fire happened. But Ruth's father died 10 days later. He which was a nail on the coffin, so to speak. But
it reminds me of 1984 in our family. Our house burned down, and fortunately,
I didn't know that.
We didn't lose everything, but all the photo albums that were in the garage.
Mm-hmm.
That same year, I got meningitis, and my mom's dad died. And you're right. When you haven't been through the experience of a house fire, and particularly the experience of losing everything like that, the clothes on your back, nothing impacts you psychologically quite like that.
Well, as you say that, it's really interesting, because when your house burns, you become part of a club that you really don't know actually exists out there. And that club is people just show up and they hand you $50.
Yeah.
They hand you a plate of lasagna and you have no idea who they are. And you go, "Why are you doing this?" "Oh, my house burned down, and, this is what you do."
Yeah.
So, every time we know of somebody whose house is burning, we're part of the club.
Yep.
We know exactly what they need, and they need that plate of lasagna, or they need $50,
Yep.
Because a lot of times people can't access their bank accounts.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
The
checkbooks burn,
Everything's gone. Now, fortunately, the house was rebuilt. It's gorgeous now. Sits on the property overlooking Seneca Lake. Some of my favorite memories have been some dinners with you and your wife, Ruth. Wonderful cooks and wonderful wine.
Yeah. And that's a wonderful time. So
It is. So when we go back, the interest for you with regards to getting into the wine industry, I know it stemmed from an old sweetheart.
Yep.
And it led you out west to California.
Yeah, I was actually out living out there. I'd gone out to visit friends and stayed. And I had a real estate company that specialized in ranches and resorts. And for those of you who are out there old enough, in 1980, the interest rates hit 22%.
Unbelievable.
Well, people don't buy property at that high interest rate. So I was out of work, and my girlfriend at the time was working at Canocti for harvest. And Canocti got an order from the Stanford Alumni Association. They'd bottled up the wine, but they didn't. The label went all the way around, and they didn't have a labeler to do it. So they need somebody to hand label these bottles of wine. And so I did, and it took about 30 days to label 1,000 cases. And February comes around, and Lane had gotten a job of assistant winemaker at Firestone. So we moved down there, and I started working on the bottling line at Firestone, fell in love with the business, closed my company, and said, I'm going to take jobs that teach me how to be a winemaker. And so from Firestone, I went to Zach Mesa as their cellar master. And then Ken Brown, who was the winemaker there, was starting his own winery. And so I went over to Byron for harvest in 1984 and learned a lot there. And at that time, I hadn't visited family in a while. So I came back to visit my father and my mother here in Rochester. And being the cocky little California wine guy, I figured I'd go wine tasting. Well, at that time, there were only about 20 wineries in the Finger Lakes. And
what year was that?
Huh?
What year was that?
1984.
Okay.
And so I'd go tooling around, and the last winery I ended up at was Wagner. And I tasted their 1982 Chardonnay, and it blew my mind. It was the first really cool climate wine I'd ever had. That light, crisp acidity. It was so well made, and I just said, well, this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I'd never tasted anything in California with that complexity, with that lower alcohol, with the acidity, the brightness, the refreshness that it had. And so I went back and gave notice and packed up my bags, figuring, I'm from California, I can get a job anywhere, as a winemaker, and came back, and I discovered that that's not true. Most of the wineries, if not all the wineries, either had a winemaker or, the family, the owner was making the wines. And that's how I got into sales. And I worked retail shops, and then I worked for a distributor. And then I was offered the job as general manager at Pindar Vineyards on Long Island. And so I went down there and for a couple of years. My father came down with cancer. I asked Dr. Damianos if I could take a leave of absence, and he said, sure. And so my father didn't really need me, but I just sort of wanted to be around him, in case he did, and in case his wife couldn't take him to the hospital or whatever needed to be done. And at that time, my first partner approached me and said, let's buy a winery. And so this is 1992.
Okay.
And I started looking around, and I would show him winery after winery, and I would drive by Fox Run, which opened in 1990. So this is 2 years later.
Yeah.
Not once did I think of stopping to say, hey, do you want to sell? And Andy, my original partner, finally one day said to me, he said, I don't want to see any more wineries.
Yeah.
The person who runs my construction company, Ruth, take her along. Next time you got to see something. And if she likes it, I'll come down and take a look at it. Well, a little while later, I get a phone call from Larry Wildrick, who is the owner of Fox Run. And Larry said, Scott, we would like to sell the winery, and we'd like to sell it to you.
Yeah.
And I said, well, why would you like to sell? You've only been open for 2 years. And he said, well, it's not retirement. I go, yeah, that's true. But why are you calling me? And he said, well, you don't want to make the second mistake in the wine business. And I said, well, what's the first? And he said, starting a winery and not knowing what you're doing. And I said, well, then what's the second? He said, selling it to somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And we know that you've been in the business for years. We know you've been looking. And in the back of my mind, and I kept saying to myself, and fortunately, Scott, you have a partner who's got a lot of money. So, one thing led to another. I took over in 1993 for Harvest, and we closed on St. Paddy's Day in 1994.
Fantastic. Thinking about how much the industry has changed in the Finger Lakes, there are owner winemakers out there, and there are owners involved in the vineyards, but the businesses in a lot of cases have grown to a point where the owner really is managing the business. I think that speaks to the growth, because you look around the industry now and there are people who have come from all over the world, employed, as winemakers, as specialists in hospitality, as specialists in wine club. What was Fox Run like in 1992 when you first stepped in to visit? I imagine that was an owner-operated winemaker, viticulture run business.
Yeah, well, they Jim Gifford, if you know your history way back, Jim Gifford was the consulting winemaker. And, Larry and Adele just sort of took care of it. Larry was a psychiatrist, and Adele was a retired school teacher. And so that first year, 1992, there was 7,000 people had come through the tasting room. In in 2006, we had over 80,000 people taste wine. So it just shows you the growth that happened. In 1993, when we finally owned Fox Run, there were 14 wineries on Seneca Lake. Now there's well over 100.
Yeah.
You know, it was impossible to get people to come, because nobody knew we existed. One day I was driving to Rochester and to visit my dad.
Yep.
And I'm one of those people who looks at his watch. I got to be on time all the time. You know, it's just a something that I actually do. And I looked at my watch, and it took me 55 minutes. Well, having been brought up in Rochester, way back then, there was this wall around Rochester, which was perceived as 1 hour.
Yep.
And nobody would, for a day trip, nobody drive more than an hour. So I started a radio campaign that said, "Hi, I'm Scott Osborn. I own Fox Run Vineyards. We're only 55 minutes from downtown Rochester. Come down and visit. Our tasting room's open, blah, blah, blah." Well, that next year, we had 18,000 people show up from Rochester who said, "Well, we didn't realize you were so close." And then I had my staff and myself would say, "Well, you know, Anthony Road is only 2 miles down the road. You should go visit them."
Yeah.
Well, then Anthony Road said, "You know, Prejean is only 5 minutes down the road. You should go down and visit them." And so Rochester ended up discovering the Finger Lakes. And, you know, then it became Syracuse and then Buffalo. It was really interesting watching those changes over those early years.
That is probably some of the best ROI on marketing money you've ever spent.
That was.
And it actually makes me think, Scott, you know, you made the decision to run that ad in Rochester. That's where you were from. It's a natural place for us to go. Syracuse is about 55 minutes from Fox Run as well. And in some ways, it still feels like city-wise, Syracuse has adopted the Finger Lakes a little less than Rochester has. Rochester feels more identifiable as the Finger Lakes city. I wonder how much of that stems from some of that early marketing efforts and decisions that were made in those first days of the wine trail, of what the efforts you were putting out there.
Well, we did the wine trail, did a couple of surveys, and we noticed that the majority of people were coming from Rochester. So we had the wine trail had limited amounts of money. Mm-hmm. So we sunk that small amount of money into Rochester, and I think that had a lot to do with it. Cayuga Lake is much closer to Syracuse, you know, and so we sort of felt that would be, Cayuga Lake. Syracuse was Cayuga Lake, and that was just our feeling. So we spent our money in Rochester, and I think that had a lot to do with it.
Yeah. It has been great to see the synergy, though, between having a kind of an urban center, which has experienced, up until COVID, its own sort of restaurant renaissance and appreciation of local foods. You need cities like that near these sort of agricultural, agro-tourism regions to help put more money into these businesses.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, it also gives people, some place to stay that's relatively close by.
Exactly.
That was in the early years. That's one of the big problems that we would have is there were no major hotels.
Yeah.
B&Bs would close November 1st and not open until May or June.
Yeah.
You know, and we would see all these people come down and you know, I'd be working the register and there'd be a young couple and they go, "Oh, you know, we got mom and dad decided to take care of the kids for the weekend. We got the whole weekend. Where can we stay?" And I would say, "Well, you probably can stay in Rochester." And they would go, "Well, we're from Rochester." And I go, "Well, that's where you better be staying. So get a hotel," you know, because it was really challenging, you know, and it took, it wasn't until the 2000s that somebody started building hotels. I think it was the Ramada up there was the first big hotel, and they had I think 120, 140 rooms, and once he finished it, he said, "Oh, I made it too small."
Unbelievable. Yeah, there are now several additional hotels, especially in Geneva, going up all over. Heads and beds is what we say in the industry we need. I want to go back just real quickly, your experience, you know, Santa Barbara specifically. So that's where Firestone is. You know, even from the period back then, and incidentally, Firestone makes a pretty decent Riesling for California.
They do.
They sell a lot of Riesling. it's amazing to see how much that region has changed too. Have you been out there recently?
Well, probably not for 5 or 6 years, but yes, it has. When I went there were 8 wineries in all of Santa Barbara.
Wow.
And it's huge now. I don't know how many are out there, but there's a lot.
So back in that era, I imagine you were spending time with the folks from Fox and
Yep.
Some kind of great old guards there as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Fox Run, this is Santa Barbara Winery. And then there's a couple that I can't think of offhand. I should have.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
And my girlfriend at the time, Lane Tanner, she left Zacamesa and started her own brand. And she made Pinots for a long time. And then she quit after Sideways because there was some challenges out there where everybody was making Pinot. And she's just
started making Merlot.
But she's now working for, I think it's Lumen.
Okay.
And she's making Pinot again. And if you've never had one of her Pinots, you should probably start because they're some of the best made in California and they're the least known for sure.
Fantastic. So we've seen different regions in this country change. Americans seem to have adopted wine more and more, higher quality wine in terms of the effort, more authentic in terms of place. And our businesses have grown too. You and I have been in business together. We had a European venture. Some of my favorite memories are still having mussels and fries in Belgium with you and drinking Chardonnay. But you're also other places. Where else in the world have you been able to venture out and have wines made in our little wine region drank?
Well, we've been fortunate and it's some of it is very odd. We don't have the money to put an international sales manager on the road, have them travel and try to pick up distributorships or importers. Our first venture outside the country was I got an email from this kid in Alberta, and he said, we're looking for some Finger Lakes wines. And it turned out later that we were the only one who responded to him. We started shipping our wines to Alberta, and it was absolutely amazing because they had changed the way they did business. And they used to be everything was run by the government.
Yep.
They privatized everything except for the warehouse and the shipping and the importation. And so it was just like the Wild West. Then we were going to Europe a lot with the New York Wine and Grape Foundation and their MAP program, which means Market Access Program. And I was at a tasting in Belgium, and I kept trying to get an importer, and they would say, well, ship us 5 cases. Well, shipping 5 cases to Europe is like $100 a case. Yeah. And, you can't, the price point is just totally out of range. And so I was talking to a friend of mine, Christian Clausens, and I was lamenting about this and how, if we were able to put together a container, we could bring the price down to, maybe $10 a case, and so he said, well, I'll put up the money if you find 3 other wineries. And I found 2, Anthony Road and Bellangelo. And we started a company, and in 2013, I think we shipped 4 container loads of New York wines to Europe. And we could be price competitive on the shelf because of that. And we would take other New York wines. If we had room on our container, we'd take other pallets of New York wines so we could make sure that we were getting New York wines to Europe, where they could be price competitive. Yep. Things changed, and tariffs went up, and and so it's been real hard at this point. Then China, just before the tariffs, we were shipping wine to China, and I think once the tariffs go away, if that ever happens, then I think you'll see one of the largest markets for New York wines will be China.
It's so complementary to the cuisines you find in all the different regions of the country. It's funny to use the word Wild West with regards to Alberta because Calgary is sort of like the Texas of Canada.
It is.
And they have one of the world's largest rodeos.
Yeah, it's the oldest too, one of the oldest.
And you were the featured wine for the rodeo, weren't you?
2 years running. Our Chardonnay was the Chardonnay for all the boxes, and all the suites and everything like that, which was huge.
Yeah.
To have a little New York winery out there in Alberta, pouring wine for all these cowboys, and we sold 200 cases in 10 days of Chardonnay, which was amazing.
Wow.
When you think about it.
Yeah.
And they were getting, I think it was $70 Canadian per bottle. And I was going, I wish I could get that kind of money for my wine.
I mean, to me, that's sort of the exciting thing that happens in frontier wine regions. Yep. I had long been asked, well, you're from California. Why didn't you just go to Napa Valley? And I would always say, well, so I'm kind of the opposite of the mindset of guys like John Lennon. John Lennon was asked, why do you live in New York? He said, because it's the center of the world. If I was alive 2,000 years ago, I'd live in Rome. Mm-hmm. But I have to be at the center of everything. So there are people who do that. And then there are people who seek frontiers where there is still room to make big things happen. Mm-hmm. And, I can't think of any better frontier story than an upstate New York winery selling to one of the largest rodeos in Western Canada in the world.
It's amazing. And, and that you say that, and I know that's why you came to the Finger Lakes, because, you didn't want to be in a pond with a bunch of big fish. You wanted to come someplace where you could actually make a statement. You're a tremendous winemaker, and the wines that you are making, they add to the overall quality and the experience here in the Finger Lakes. And, there are a number of people who've come here just because, they know that they can make a difference.
Yeah. And it's funny because I do love the cool climate nature. I like the lower alcohol. I love Riesling. You know what I love more than anything else, though, is there just aren't that many big egos, right? So in every industry, if you're on Wall Street in New York City, if you're in oil in North Dakota, anytime there's a center of something and it attracts some great talent, you're constantly rubbing up against people who just don't have time for you because their egos are so big. But when we first moved here, and I knew that wasn't the mood of the region, I was reading Evan Dawson's book as I was packing my things in California, Summer in a Glass.
That's a great read. It is a wonderful read.
It is. But I came here, and really within about 2 months, I just called you up and said, hey, can I sit down? Like, the first person who started Fox Run, I'm in the wine industry now, and I have no idea what I'm doing. And you sat me down, and I mean, that was really the start of our friendship. But that has been one of those unique things about the Finger Lakes. And it probably is bred from the fact that, we are real workers. We're real farmers. We're tied to this ground in this place. And it isn't just, some retirement project for most of us.
Right. And it's also not corporate.
Yeah.
I think once you get into corporations that are run either by stockholders or even somebody who's just made a ton of money on something else, all of a sudden secrets are part of doing business. And that's where people who don't really know what the wine industry is about is a big mistake that they make, because the recipe is published all over. It's like cooking.
Yeah.
And one of the things I always tell chefs that I run into or used to work for us or whatever, especially the ones that didn't want to share their recipes, I go, how many famous chefs do you know that don't share their recipes? Well, you don't know any chefs that don't share their recipes. Yeah. And that's the same thing with winemaking. we all have recipes and we can all talk about it, but you can take my recipe and you can make Chardonnay.
Yeah.
But it isn't going to taste like Fox Runs.
Nope.
For a whole bunch of different reasons. And that misunderstanding is key to, I think, why you see, non-disclosure agreements and things like that going on. And here in the Finger Lakes, because most of the wineries are family owned, even the ones that are corporate owned because that's just the best way to run your business, but they're family owned corporations. And, there's a belief here that, the better our neighbors do, the better we're going to do, and the better our region is going to do. And so any chance that we can get to help our neighbors, it's going to help the region be a better place.
So I'm a big believer in the importance of place. Whether you're growing grapes or not, like maybe you're a school teacher, the importance of place being your community, the food that is grown around there, the local barber shops, those connections that make life worth living. But in wine, we talk about place a lot of times with regard to the actual soils, with regards to the climate, and with regards to the influence of the winemaker. The French call it terroir. Mm-hmm. I know people debate whether or not it exists. I think it does. I think we still need to figure out what our terroir is here.
Correct.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the thing about terroir is most people don't understand it, and so they make shit up.
Yeah.
And, it's the slate in the soil makes it taste slatey. Well, that's not true. Yeah. But some writer who doesn't really understand it wrote about it, and people believe that.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge with terroir. And I agree. I believe it exists. It's just a concept that's really hard to wrap your head around.
It is, because it takes in so many different factors.
Correct. Yep.
Sort of with that said, and understanding that we have an evolving understanding of it here. This isn't France. We don't have hundreds of years and tens of generations farming the land yet. We'll get there. But you have a really cool series, because even though, and I agree with you, the specific soil, you aren't tasting that specific soil in the glass. It does influence how those grapes grow, the drainage, the composite of whatever is in the ground. And you've got a cool geological series where you highlight this.
Yeah, and it's we've been doing that for years. Just we've been trying to figure out the differences in our soil types and the elevations and all that kind of stuff. And it's very interesting to ferment something the same way. And this is the challenge with trying to decide what your terroir happens to be, and that is, if you're going to do comparisons, you have to ferment everything exactly the same way. Mm-hmm. You have to stop the fermentations at exactly the same time, which can be complicated during harvest. And so we've done it a couple of times, and then there are times when, something else was going on and we didn't stop them at the same time. So even though we do have those separate wines, they are different just because the winemaking was slightly different on it.
There are a couple that stand out for me. I always particularly like the Lake Dana expression.
And it's funny, that's the one I like too.
Well, you've got good taste.
Yeah, thanks.
And so this is the other thing I just love about wine is we're constantly telling multiple layers of stories with every single bottle. So you want to share Lake Dana, a little bit of the history, how you came up with that name, why that name for your vineyard.
It was interesting because I was, the geology of the Finger Lakes, and I was trying to figure out what our property was and, how many different types of soil and all that kind of stuff. And I was talking to a professor at the Hobart William Smith, a geology professor, and I was talking about this. She said, well, I'll have my students do a special project. And so they came down, they dug 150 test holes around the property. And, then once they got done, they compiled all that information. And she came down and said, well, guess what you have? And I said, well, what? And she said, well, you have the shoreline of Lake Dana on your property. And I go, Lake Dana? All I know is Seneca Lake. She goes, well, 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers were melting, they couldn't drain south because elevations south of us were too high. So the glaciers had to melt, almost to Rochester and Syracuse before they started draining east and west. And then it took 1,000 years to drain out to Seneca Lake. Yeah. And so you have the shoreline of Lake Dana. And she goes, shorelines are really obvious if you're a geologist. Yeah. And it's 6 feet of a sandy loam soil that's unique to shorelines worldwide. Okay, that's great. And she goes, and the other thing you have is you got a hanging delta, or what they call a paleo delta. And I go, and that is? Well, it turns out we have this stream on our property. There were a series of unnamed lakes where they found a shoreline, but it wasn't big enough for the geologists to give it a name.
Interesting.
But there were 3 of them between Route 14 and Seneca Lake, and this stream drained out in that area and created this delta. And that is 8 feet of sand with some layers of clay in it. And the clay is pink, which is really fascinating when you dig down in it and you see these layers. So that's a hanging delta. And that's where we came up with the geology series. We made Riesling from Lake Dana, and we made Riesling from the hanging delta using both the same clones and the same fermentation techniques. And our winemaker claims that there's no difference, but he's the only one. Yeah. Everybody else says they can find a difference between the two. And it's interesting. About 50% of the people like the Lake Dana, 50% like the hanging delta, and when they're tasting them side by side. I, in blind tastings, have always picked the Lake Dana for some reason.
I have too. I do think there is a difference.
Yeah, there is definite.
Peter Bell, your winemaker, is brilliant. And he has been a real leader for a lot of us as winemakers. And he's got so much experience. He's particularly good at fortified wines. But he has a great scientific mind. But he's one of these people who, once he has decided something, that is the answer.
that is the answer. Yep.
I'm not like that. I sometimes will go back and forth. But it's that sort of strong mind that has actually helped the region. And he's decided how to make great Riesling, and he does every single year.
And, just to his defense a little, he does change.
Yeah.
It takes years and years and years. For instance, he liked to make Chardonnay, but he hated it. And now he's sort of come around that cool climate Chardonnays are actually really good. Yeah. It's taken 20 years, but yeah, no, he's a fascinating guy. He's a great teacher.
Yes.
I'm always enthralled and amazed to listen to him speak, to the consumer or to scientists or whatever, because he does it so well. I love listening to him.
And he has also changed his mind in some ways with regards to how we ferment Riesling. And he's embraced a small part, but some new oak, or some older oak, rather, some neutral oak. And you have you call it Sylvan Riesling, and this is your barrel fermented and aged Riesling.
Yeah, Ruth and I were in the Mosel, and we were, have a number of friends there who own wineries, and we were touring around, and, I called in a couple of friends' favors and got some nice visits at different wineries, and I noticed there are these large casks that they were fermenting and aging their wines in, and so I came back to Peter and I said, let's try this, and he goes, oh no, you can't do that, and I go, well, why not? And he says, well, it over oaks the wines, and I mean, you've tasted this is this. He named a number of different wineries, and they're all over oaked, and I said, let's use a 10-year-old oak barrel with no flavor and see what happens. And he goes, oh yeah, we could try that. So the first year we did it, we did one barrel, 2 months in the barrel after fermentation, and we racked it off. It was a beautiful wine, but it lost a lot of the characteristics of that Riesling. And so the next year we did 2 barrels, and Peter pulled it out after 30 days, and it still lost the aromatics that we really like in Riesling. And so now what we've done, and we found that we just hit the sweet spot, and that is you use really old oak barrels that have absolutely no flavor anymore. You ferment the wine in the barrel and to dryness, and it takes about 18 days, give or take.
Because when it's in a barrel and it's not a temperature-controlled environment, these fermentations can really pick up a lot of heat. They can go fairly quickly, and that might be in some cases where you lose the aromatics, but anyway.
And, it depends. So sometimes it goes in 15 days, sometimes it goes in 20, and, so we feel we've gotten to we found how to do that in a way that makes a really unique style of Riesling. And when you pour it to the consumer, the American consumer who believes all Rieslings are sweet, it blows their minds because it's dry, it's crisp, it's lively. It's really a neat wine. I gave you 2 bottles, by the way.
Thank you. And I haven't had, this is the 18 vintage. I think at home I have the 17, so I'm really excited to try it. I'm a big believer in some barrel fermented Riesling as well. It tends to be a blending component for me. I find that although we lose some aromatics, we really do gain some breadth on the mid palate.
Oh, the palate feel is
and with that, I'm not quite sure how long you guys age it for in barrel. How long is it in barrel then, for just about 2-3 months?
No, it's in the barrel 18 days. We pull it out as soon as fermentation is done. We pull it out. You get the palate feel that we're sort of looking for.
Yep.
But you retain a lot of that aromatic. And I've talked about it with Peter about being a blending component, but as a standalone wine, it seems to do really well.
It is. And, you guys have been such a standard bearer for so long. You've got a house style. And Peter certainly does. It's hard to prevaricate from that too much.
It is.
We do a single bottling called Feu de Chêne, and that's just because my wife told me that means aged in oak in French.
Really?
But we then get to have extra strange characters on the label.
Right.
So little carrots over each.
Nice being married to a French woman, I'll tell you. That helps.
It is. You also produce a Traminette and some other varietals that aren't well known outside the region. Care to talk about that? Because I particularly like your Traminette.
Okay. Yeah, so do I. I'm really excited about that one. But it's really interesting. When I came here in 92 and 93, the whole hybrid thing everybody talked bad about hybrids. And, the Spectator, the Wine Enthusiast, none of the major magazines. They wouldn't even review them. No, they wouldn't. Yeah. And they would... the writers would ask, why are you growing this? And then I read an article in the Spectator, probably 98 or 99, all these great new varieties being grown in Oregon, and Baco Noir was one of them. And I'm going, wait a minute, how can Oregon grow a hybrid and not get criticized for it? But things changed. And, one of the problems with the New York, being a winery in New York in the early years is everybody remembered all the bad wines that had been made beforehand, the jug wines and, the things that just, people never really liked. And there was a lot of bad winemaking going on. And, so you're going to develop an attitude about, these wines suck because everyone I've had has sucked, But I maintain that, now with the younger generation, whose parents have been drinking wine from all over the world, they don't have the prejudices against New York that a lot of the older people do. Yeah. And they want to know if a wine tastes good. And they don't care that it's one of the royal varieties, the Chardonnay or the Riesling or the Pinot Noir. They don't care. Yeah. They want good wine. And with good winemaking, and our Traminette is outstanding. And but it just shows you what good winemaking can do for a grape that is a wine grape.
Exactly. When I first had moved back here, I'd taken the bar exam in New York couple years before, and I just hadn't gone through the process of, swearing in. And so when I was sworn in, it was probably a month after I had moved here. And there was a gentleman who was there. His daughter had been admitted. He was a lawyer, probably in his 60s, and kind of smugly said to me, "So where are you going to be practicing?" I said, "Well, I'm actually not going to be practicing. I'm making wine in the Finger Lakes." And he said, "What are you doing?" Taylor Port is all he knew.
Right.
And I didn't get into an argument. And I just said, things have changed. And there is this, in the older set, people who haven't rediscovered what New York is about. There is a misconception of what we're doing here, but it's changing.
Yeah, it is a lot. And, it's, this is that older generation that prevents us from being in all the restaurants. It's, it's that older generation that has prevented us from, being the great region that we are.
Yeah.
But as we get those scores, and as, the Spectator and the Wine Enthusiast and Wine and Spirits magazine write about us and give us these high scores, we're breaking down that barrier.
Yeah.
And so now in Rochester and Syracuse, you're seeing a lot more Finger Lakes wines on the wine lists, which is really important because that's where a lot of people will try their wine for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
That's also where, your wine club members and your real fans, they see it on the wine list. Oh, yeah, geez, I'm going to have that Fox Run Riesling, or I'm going to drink that Chardonnay. That's... Yep. They then support you if they can buy it. And I had one restaurant owner said, "Well, I don't put New York wines on my wine list because nobody ever asks." And I said, "Well, why don't you put some on and see if they sell?"
Yeah.
Because people aren't going to ask, or if they do ask, they're going to ask the server. The server doesn't turn around and tell the owner,
No.
"Oh, by the way, I had 25 people today ask for New York wines." That just doesn't happen. So, it's changed, and it's a real positive change. And there's some really fine restaurants that are, they make a point of carrying the good wines out of the Finger Lake.
And that actually brings me to another topic I wanted to talk with you about, Scott, just the business of wine. One of my favorite stories is your response to a liquor store owner with regards to you visiting the store. You know which one I'm talking about?
The one in Buffalo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you could share that.
Yeah. I went into, we had just gone with a distributor statewide. And, so I was doing what we call a work with, which means, you go out with the salesman or the sales manager in that particular market, and you go visit all these different stores. And so, we went into this one store, and as we're driving, it's first thing in the morning, and I'm with the sales manager. She goes, "Oh, yeah, this guy's great. I know him really well. He's a personal friend. We'll be able to get a placement here." And there's sort of this unwritten rule that when the managers come in, you make a placement. You want to, the store owner wants to make them look good. So we go in there, and there's also this courtesy that if there are other salesmen there, you let them do their presentations, and then, you sort of stand in line. And so after about an hour, we made it to this guy. But I'd been wandering around the store, and I went over to the New York section, and there were a number of wines on the wall. But then there was this huge stack of Chilean wines in front of it.
Yeah.
And yet, if you weighed more than 110 pounds, it was really hard to get in between that stack and the New York section. So I sort of knew that this guy was not a real fan. And so we go through, we're tasting through all the wines, and he goes, "Wow, you've got some nice wines. These are really nice." And I said, "Oh, great. And are there any that you would like to carry?" "Oh, no, I don't have enough room." And so the sales manager says, "Well, we're discontinuing a couple of wines, and I can take them right away today, and you can put them right in there." No. And I said to the store manager, or the store owner, I said, "That's a wonderful South African section you got there." And he goes, "Well, thank you." And I said, "Well, how many of your customers have been to South Africa?" And he goes, "Well, probably none."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, about 15% of my customers are from Buffalo, and, I bet a lot of them come to your store. And he didn't say anything. And then I said, well, when do you think Bob Mondavi is going to come in next? And he goes, never. And I said, I'm the owner of my winery, and you're important to me. And I've come all the way here, to present some really nice wines to you. And he said, get out of my store. And he threw me right out of the store. And the sales manager came over and he goes, I just want you to know, it's the first time I've ever been thrown out of a store. And he goes, I can't believe it, because this guy was at my wedding.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the attitude back in the mid to late 90s.
Yeah.
It's just, it was tough back then. And, you really had to be able, if you were a salesperson selling New York wines, you had to be ready to have somebody tell you no all day long. And maybe you might get lucky at the end of the day with somebody saying, yeah, sure, I'll take these wines.
By the time I had entered the Finger Lakes wine industry, it wasn't like that at all in upstate.
Mm-hmm.
You got some great stores like Market View Liquor.
Oh, tremendous.
I mean, really, in Rochester, every store has a very solid collection of New York wines. Closest for me has been, before the pandemic and when we were really trying, sales in New York City. I mean, it is the toughest wine market in the world, and you constantly have the best winemakers in the world traveling there and meeting with folks. But even there, it's been amazing to see some of the placements that we have been able to get and how much wine we have been able to move. So it's changing.
It is. Oh, it's a lot. And, the problem with New York City is everybody in the world wants to be there.
Yep.
So you have these huge wineries from all over the world, and they can afford to have 10 salespeople directly from the winery working the market. And, and that's where the challenge comes in, because here we are, these small family-owned wineries. I'm 20,000 case winery, but that's like a garage winery in California or in some of these European countries. It's like they spill more in a day than I make in a year. But, that's the challenge with New York. And, it's changing. Long Island has had a big effect on that, because of their proximity and the amount of people who go visit the Long Island wineries. So it's opened up a lot of minds. And so they're a lot more acceptable to us coming in there. Your wines, my wines, tons of wines here in the Finger Lakes that are all world class.
Yep.
And when you pour them to somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, it blows their minds. And, they have no problem putting our wines on their wine list because they're good.
Yeah. That is a weird feeling. Again, I'm not distributed in New York City right now. Just, it's not a focus for
Neither
us.
am I.
Yeah. And but when we still were, that feeling when you're going down for sales meetings and it's New York City. We're used to a very different pace up here.
Yeah, right.
And it's bustling, and they're getting through, dozens of wineries, and you're meeting with folks, and there's wineries from around the world, and you're always talking to the regional national sales manager for X brand, and I'm like, I'm the owner winemaker with a handful of good, hardworking employees, and I drove down here last night. It's a different world.
Totally.
But that's what I love about it. And I think it speaks to the authenticity of the region.
Yep.
With that said, we do, as you've mentioned, we've got a lot more wineries than we've ever had here. And I know that in recent years, there's always questions like, have we reached a saturation in the number of wineries? Is it healthy for the region? I know Chateau Ste. Michelle, I think they make 1 million cases of their mainline Riesling. And it would literally take every single one of us in the Finger Lakes teaming up to pour our Riesling in to make 250,000 cases. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it just, just the way it is that we have the number of wineries we do?
Well, we do have a lot of wineries, but a lot of them are, I think 80% of the wineries in the Finger Lakes, for instance, are less than 5,000 gallons. Well, that's, they're selling whatever they can make, most of it out of their tasting room, and maybe they go out 50 miles in terms of distribution. That other 15%, have distributors and get out further. Like you say, you're not in New York City. Well, you don't have the production to be in New York City. And I think that's sort of an example of, there is room for people. There's a lot of room for people to produce a lot of wine.
Yeah.
And go national, because, there's a lot of room out there to do that. And, now that we can ship, to almost every state, we have a big marketplace out there and people are coming to visit. So I don't think we're at that point. There are some other considerations that would make our industry grow quite well, but, that's for another conversation.
No problem. And, when I think about it, I don't think of it in this is good or bad. I guess the answer is, or the question is there a way for the Finger Lakes to at least have one label that is everywhere in the U.S.? Are we going to reach a point where we can find enough market dominance so that everybody knows Finger Lakes and can pick up a bottle for dinner, whether they're in Oregon or Texas?
That's a tough question. It is totally possible.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what we need is an investment, somebody who's got tons of money, who's willing to plant a lot of acreage, and buy a lot of grapes. The challenge that we have is, the cost of grapes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm paying $1,500 to $1,600 a ton for Riesling.
Yep.
In California, they're paying $200 or $300 or $400 a ton. That affects the final price on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And, part of that high price is because there's just not enough Riesling being grown.
Yeah.
So until we have plenty of grapes out there, until we have wineries that are going national like Fox Run, or you grow and you're national, until those, we need multiple wineries to be that large.
Yep.
And then you'll see them all over the place.
I have to admit that I'm perfectly comfortable where we are. I like the idea that we can ship, we can serve customers in a lot of different places, and it's a lot less stress on us having to travel around, particularly these days where we can't. So I think the wine consumer is changing. The palates are broadening. Hybrids are less expensive for us, not because they're inferior, but because they require less inputs. They're more suited for this climate.
And you can get more tons per acre.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's another reason for a higher price. The less tons per acre, the higher the price of the grape is going to be.
It is an interesting equation. I know in a lot of our vineyards, it's, let's say, 3 to 6 tons per acre for Riesling. And I know in the Central Valley, some of these guys are pulling off 10, 15 tons an acre.
Oh, yeah.
It does speak to the fact that we're making a very different quality of Riesling. But when you are talking about that sort of just in other states, that grocery store placement, we can't compete on that price point.
No.
So COVID-19 has changed a lot of our businesses. We've discussed little bits and pieces of it here and there. We had changed our whole distribution model in about a year or two leading up to COVID-19. We had come out with a can like you guys. We were actually finding that...
Actually, you made me to go to cans.
I didn't make you.
No, you didn't make me, but you gave me the idea. Oh, Chris is doing it. I'll try that.
What we found was, for canned wine in particular, it was selling great at events and, places wherever people would gather. COVID-19 hurt our business wholesale-wise immensely. Our distributor's great, but it is a distributor that was more focused on on-premise, which we wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And without on-premise, we saw our sales fall. At the same time, all the work our staff put in the tasting room, we saw visitation numbers were a little lower, but people were willing to spend a lot more. And we think it's because everybody was actually there for more of the experience. They weren't just on a bus getting drunk. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, I agree totally with that. And COVID-19 gave us an opportunity to change our business model. I think many of us were trying to figure out how to limit the amount of bachelorette parties and buses driving around, and because they can be incredibly disruptive, and they can ruin the experience for a lot of other people. And with COVID-19 and the regulations, you had to be sitting down, or you had to be outside, and all of those things allowed us to change the way we handle the customer, the way we handle our tastings. And in doing so, we were able to discover that, the majority of people, they like going out wine tasting, but they also would like to taste wine and sit at a picnic table, and look out over the lake and spend time with their spouse or their friends and, just enjoy life. And, we've pretty much decided, we're our whole backyard, we just kept buying more and more picnic tables. And so now I think what we're going to do is we're going to redesign it into sort of a wine garden.
Nice.
With trees and picnic tables and, all the different things that would allow a person to relax and be in comfort.
Yep.
I think the COVID rules have given us an opportunity to separate our tables and chairs so that people we're not encroaching on people's space.
Yep.
So it's a lot easier for people to relax. And, it's for my staff and for me, the tension level and the stress level in our tasting room has dropped significantly.
Yep. It is true. I always hated this notion of a pub crawl in a van with wine, because that's not what wine is about. And I think the other part of it is we all love wine, but we understand the importance of moderation, and that wine should complement your meals and your life. It should not become the focal point of just getting drunk. That's not why we make what we make. And that got shielded over the years with the way tourism had evolved. But if you're listening to this at home and, you don't like that model, that it's another crazy wine trail, it isn't like that anymore. It's a lot more like what I experience when I visit my wife's family in Europe, where, we've got bigger buildings. It's not just, off to the side of someone's garage barn where they're making their wine, but you're sitting down, you're having your questions answered, you're experiencing it, you're experiencing the place. That's what's important.
Yep. And, we've, I put up that gate, and then I put up or planted a number of maple trees going up the driveway. My thought is, when you turn and go through that gate, and you drive up through this, hopefully in another couple of years, there'll be sort of like a tunnel of trees that you're driving under. And that subconsciously it's going to click. It's going to turn off the hustle and bustle of Route 14 and the crazy stuff that's happening at home, whatever that may be, the stress of work. And you're going to drive up there and it's going to change your attitude, and you're going to say, maybe I can relax for a couple hours. And that's what I and you and many of us want. We want people to sit down and relax, enjoy some food, with our wines, and realize, this is a wonderful place and a wonderful world to be in.
And you mentioned the gate. This was made by Sam Kastner. Folks can find the episode with Sam, an amazing artist focused on ironworks. And I guess this is kind of twofold. One, you've talked a lot in our private conversations about legacy projects. And two, we've also shared how surprised you were at this specific legacy project, just how large it was at first.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
I'm assuming it still is the largest sculpture in the Finger Lakes. And, when I went to Sam, because I saw him put up the Red Tail Ridge, a sculpture there of the tree and the hawk. And I said, wow, this guy, I wonder if he can make me a gate. And my thinking of a gate is, 2 columns with, some metal thing in between. And Sam had a much different idea. Sam had been working with Albert Paley.
Mm-hmm.
Albert Paley is the premier gate maker in the world, I think.
Mm-hmm.
His gate at the St. Louis Zoo is just unbelievable to look at. So he came by one day after we'd talked, and he said, what kind of gate do you like? And Ruth and I were looking at it, and we said, well, we like this percolate thing, this overhead. And he said, oh, okay. And I said, it's got to be tall enough for a bus or a truck to get under, and because we get grape deliveries. And he said, yeah, we'll work on it. Well, he came back with its design, which we thought was pretty spectacular. And he said, it's going to be 20 feet tall and 40 feet wide. And I go, okay. Well, I have no idea what that means. So then he comes by 6 months or 8 months later, and he digs these huge holes, and he said, I got to pour 39 tons of cement in here. And I'm going, for a gate? He says, yeah, just for the poles. And I go, okay. So he shows up one day, and he's going to put the poles in. And he puts the first one up, and I look up, and I go, Ruth is going to kill me. I had no idea what 20 feet was until he put that first post up.
And to frame it for folks, it's not just like 20 feet right next to the road. The way the Fox Run driveway is, you're driving, you actually go on a slight incline. So from the road, the gate is probably closer to like a 40-foot elevation when you're just looking up at it.
And when the gates themselves are spread out, I think it's 60, it's either 60 or 80 feet wide. Each one of the gates weighs 6,000 pounds. And Sam is so brilliant and so talented that one person can close these gates, and it's not a lot of effort. And I have a couple of very short women, who can come down and they can close that gate without a lot of effort. Which blows their mind.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I have a hard enough time closing the deer fence on my own, so that's fantastic. It's interesting. His work is popping up more and more.
Yep.
I think he's going to be a name people will know in the art world well into the future.
Oh, I think so too.
And he's also the son-in-law of John and Ann Martini, correct?
Yes, correct.
But he doesn't really have a foot so much in the wine world. He is about his art.
Yeah, and he's a fabulous teacher. I know he does classes at Hobart, William Smith, and at Keuka College on sculpture classes, because one of the Keuka College, a couple of people from the sculpture class helped him build our gate. And they and then the photography department filmed the whole thing.
Wow.
So there's we do have a DVD that that you can watch while you're standing in the tasting room, and it's pretty amazing.
It is. And we've put up a picture so folks have had a chance to see it. On the other part, legacy. I think of you as a young man, Scott. I plan on having my son work next to you one day.
Good.
Maybe doing an internship at Fox Run with Peter Bell. But I think we're always thinking in the world of wine, this isn't for us. This is really for future generations.
Mm-hmm.
Other legacy projects, what you're thinking about your legacy in the Finger Lakes, I'm just interested to hear.
That is really a tough question because, I got involved in this because I fell in love with the industry. I've always been a people person. I love to meet people from all over the world. The college I went to had campuses all over the world. And so I spent my college years in other countries, and wine was a tool that I could help me communicate with people, even if we had a hard time understanding each other because of the language barrier. Wine was the tool, I guess would be the best term for that. And I love this. I get up every morning and, I want to meet people. I want to hear their stories, and I want to tell my story. Well, my kids aren't as enthusiastic about that as I am, and my daughter is a wonderful person. She's probably the most organized person in our company.
Yeah.
But this is not it's not her dream. Whereas this is my dream.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was dating Ruth, I'd told her I loved her at one point, and so we started, and she felt the same way, and so we started making plans, and one of the things I said to her is, I said, this has been a dream of mine for my whole life, and I need you to understand that what it is, and that you can't be jealous. You have to understand that this is not a competition against your affections and my affections to the winery and my affections to you. This is just a passionate thing that I have to do.
Yeah.
And I said, I want you to think about this. And she spent probably a good year and a half. And then one day she sat me down and she said, I get it, I understand it, and I can handle it. And she's been a wonderful part of the growth of this business. And but I think you need that.
You do.
And I think when it comes to legacy and taking over, your children and Jessica and Michael, they may change their minds down the road and all of a sudden come on board. But at this point in time, it's Ruth and I, and my mother's still alive at 94, so I figure I got plenty of time left.
You do. It is one of the truest things I've heard, that this is an industry that you don't just work in. I mean, it is inside you.
Correct. Yep.
And if that drive isn't there, you are in the wrong industry.
Correct. Yep.
So, with that said, we actually have a Chardonnay that I wouldn't mind getting inside me right now.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm gonna let you describe it, because that's one of the things that we've started to do at Fox Run. I try to encourage my employees not to tell the customer what a wine tastes like, because we want you all to think about it.
Yep.
And that the other thing that we all constantly say is there's no wrong answer.
Yep.
Because this is about you, and this is about your flavor sensations, your taste sensations. What you smell, I might not smell. You realize that we all know that there's certain smells that are strong.
Yeah.
Peter, for instance, can't smell TCA or corkiness in a wine.
And that's because you're using Diam right now.
Yeah, now it is. That's why we went to synthetics at one point too. So, this and I know this is your wife's favorite wine. So, and this was one of the things that really introduced us. Our families together was this style here. But this is also the style that brought me back from California, because this is the style that Wagner was. And Peter said this the other day, this is probably the best Chardonnay he's ever made. I'm loving this wine right now. But
it's brilliant. So this is the 2019 Fox Run Reserve Chardonnay.
Yep.
Kaiser Vineyard, named after John Kaiser, your current vineyard manager.
Correct.
Kind of named in honor of him.
So this is barrel fermented and aged in oak barrels for about 10 months. It goes through malolactic fermentation, which is a secondary fermentation that happens after the primary yeast fermentation.
Beautiful notes of spring flower, white flower, coupled with it like this hint of nectarine. It's like sitting on top of this beautiful sort of like creme brulee, these toasty notes that just sort of bounce out of the glass. It's beautiful.
And what I'm noticing here is the way it feels in your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
There's that creamy, but soft, and yet your salivary glands start to kick off. And
So that is the amazing thing about the Finger Lakes. Now, it takes a great hand like Peter's to make a wine like this, but it's gone through malolactic. You feel that softness. It's not overpowering with kind of the butterscotch, but it's gentle on the palate, but the acidity is still there. And it's that marriage of the brightness that's causing my mouth to water, but with some of the lactic acid that has been teased out through the malolactic fermentation. A lot of the aromatic notes carry forward into the palate. I think there's almost this nice savory quality to it on the palate, and it's probably some of the acidity, but it's hinting at some of that salinity, which is one of the things I absolutely love in good Chardonnay.
And even though Riesling gets all, is the sort of the premier grape of the Finger Lakes, I think on the white end, there's Chardonnay and there's Tremonette.
Yep.
And as we learn more and more about how to make Chardonnay, and it takes years and years. It's one of the things that I think, and my friend Lane said this to me. She goes, the learning curve here in the Finger Lakes is really flat. She goes, in California, almost every vintage is the same, and so the learning curve is really steep.
Yeah.
She goes, you're going to be lucky to see 2 vintages the same in 10 years. And what that means to people who don't know is that is, you need consistency to learn on what you did right and what you did wrong.
Yep.
And if you have all these different years and different seasons and, different rainfalls and different frost and all that, it takes years and years and years to really fine tune so that you understand what to do. And fortunately, we've had Peter Bell since 1995.
Yep.
And, he was a very talented winemaker when he came to us, but he's seen so many vintages the same. And then when I say so many, it's probably 4.
Yeah.
And because of that, when he sees the grapes coming in a specific manner, he's experienced them before, and he knows what to do or he knows what not to do.
Yep. I think 2019 as a vintage does not get nearly enough credit. Especially people who write about wine and don't make wine love to write about our really hot years.
Yep.
12, 16, 20, warmer and dry. But it is years like 19 and 17 and 14 that are making the wines I love.
11.
11.
And
picked before those rains.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is with Riesling, the best Rieslings come out of years where it's raining during harvest.
Yeah.
And, where in other areas, warmer areas, people, they have heart attacks if it rains. Yeah. It's just typical for the Finger Lakes.
Yeah.
And a warm, dry year is not so typical lately. We've had more than in the last few years than we've had in the last 20. But it's amazing how Riesling really, really shines in these sort of wet years, cloudy years. And Chardonnay does the same thing.
Yep. Yep.
And when you get these warm, dry years, you're getting more of, higher alcohols, you're getting more extraction, the fruit is getting, sometimes in some cases, people let it hang too long and it gets these overripe flavors, and that's another reason that I came here was I liked the flavor development that happened early on in the grape, which allowed me to have acid, crispness, refreshing, which I find goes with food much better. I can also have a second and a third glass, and that's what it's, to me, I want to have my wine with food, and in most cases, the only time I'm drinking wine is at dinner.
Yeah.
And sometimes if somebody comes by at lunchtime, I may have a glass of wine, but then I have to take a nap after that. But, we in our family always drink it with dinner and food.
Well, that is a beautiful wine. I always like your barrel fermented Chardonnays. This is a truly standout vintage. It's really delicious.
Thank you. I was thinking about that when I was thinking about you.
Yeah.
And then I said, now I know Chris loves Chardonnay.
Yep.
And, so you'll like this. And this is actually out of the 19 vintage. This is one of the faves.
Yeah. Well, good work.
Thank you. And we can do trades.
Yeah.
Because just to pat you on the back, you do make great Chardonnay.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
that's one of the Chardonnays that we drink at home is the Bellangelo.
Well, thanks. We've got a lot of changes coming up with our own winery. We're going to be changing our name. By the time this airs, it's probably already happened.
Which is?
So we're going to be going to Missick Cellars.
Nice.
And that is in part because this is the 10th year that we've owned the winery.
Mm-hmm.
And every year around wintertime, we talk about the fact that we love the business, the winery, but this wasn't our name. We kept it when we purchased it. And it's hard to pronounce for a lot of folks. And
it's hard to spell too.
It is. And so, I always tell folks when they ask my philosophy, winemaking, it's two things, deliciousness and authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
The most authentic thing for us is to let people know who's making the wine, and then it's a family wine business.
Yep.
So we're going to be doing that this year. And part of it was really prompted after COVID so much.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the experience at the winery that's changed. It wasn't just the owners. Wasn't just good scores. It was, this isn't the winery we stepped into a decade ago.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
We made it ours.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, congratulations. I think that's a great move.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
you.
I can't wait to see the label.
And we're working on it. Well, I really want to thank you for coming by, Scott.
Sure. Chris, I totally appreciate the invitation, and it's always good to see you. And I haven't seen your lovely bride in probably a year. It's too bad, but
we have a new baby to introduce you to as well.
Oh, so, good. It's a girl, right?
It is.
Yeah. Well, we'll sit down and talk about how do you take care of a teenage daughter. 'Cause you'll need that advice.
I need all the advice I can get there. People can find you at foxrun.com, right?
Yep.
Run
yep.
and
Instagram, Facebook, all the stuff, and we're open pretty much every day except Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's Day, and if the Bills ever make the Super Bowl, we'll be closed on Super Bowl Sunday.
Sounds good. Well, everybody, do yourself a favor. Pick up not just this Chardonnay. Pick up their wonderful Tawny Port, some of their Rieslings, their Lembergers, Cab Franc. You're going to want to explore Fox Run. It is really one of the great legacy players that's still doing exciting new things in the Finger Lakes. Scott Osborn's a legend, and it's just a pleasure and an honor to have him here. I hope you enjoyed this show. This has been Viticulture, where we share ways to cultivate a good life. Don't forget to visit our website at viticulturepodcast.com. Subscribe to our Substack, where you'll get show notes, transcripts, musings, and exclusive offers. And check us out on all the major social media platforms. Thanks again for stopping by.